Most endurance athletes will come across the term threshold when doing any research on how to train, but even experienced athletes may not know what it threshold really means. 60 years ago, UCLA's Carl Wasserman theorized the idea of anaerobic threshold, and since then there has been endless controversy and confusion. And I know as a coach, I've been coaching high school starting in 2006, coaching adults full-time since 2009, and often when I tell them do a tempo run or a threshold run, there is quite a bit of confusion amongst that, and what exactly does threshold mean? So on this episode, we'll be talking about what threshold is and what does it mean and how you can get to it and achieve it possibly. Recently in the Journal of Physiology, it was concluded that anaerobic, that's exercise without oxygen, or not exercise, just without oxygen, aerobic is oxygen, ana means without, threshold does not represent the point at which you are exercising so hard that your muscles can no longer get oxygen. And this has been a big misconception. I'm sure I probably even held it myself, that, you go aerobic, where you're full on running, bringing in plenty of oxygen, then you go anaerobic, and eventually you have to stop. And so exercise can be divided into two distinct zones, easy and hard. Before you accumulate lactic acid, that's kind of the easy zone, so resting, kind of like I'm sitting here right now out in my backyard. And then when you start moving and start exercising, eventually you will create lactic acid, and then you keep building it until fatigue sets in, and you come to a cross point, and that's kind of your threshold. So anyone who had done endurance training has an intuitive feel for this transition from doable to undoable. Wasserman concluded that by measuring breathing instead of blood, one could find that critical point where the heart and lungs could no longer deliver enough oxygen to the muscles. So the muscles would have to use anaerobic energy sources that produce the dreaded lactic acid, which led to more CO2, which can be measured. So instead of doing blood tests, which now we're doing quite a bit when people are training, they're getting out of the pool or getting off the bike or off the run and taking a lactic measurement. And I'm sure that someday our watches, I've got my Fitbit here last week, pretty good, amazing how well it counts your heartbeats via your wrist. My Garmin does a pulse oxygen meter, and so I'm sure sometime in the future we'll be able to test blood lactate levels with some sort of wearable device. So Wasserman theorized that instead of doing blood tests, you could just measure CO2, because CO2 is produced when you've got the lactic acid buildup. And so while his ideas were interesting and influential, we have changed the way we think about it. We don't actually have lactic acid circulating in our blood. We have lactate. Lactate isn't a dead-end waste product of anaerobic metabolism. It is extra fuel for the muscles, a signaling molecule that helps tell the body to adapt and get fitter. Lactate isn't produced because your muscle can't get enough oxygen. And I think this is something that I definitely, when I read this article in Outside Magazine, was like, wow, so lactic acid, your body really hasn't got lactic acid, it's the lactate. And they kind of get interchanged, and so it's not like, you run out of oxygen, lactic acid builds up, and you stop. It's that your body creates lactate, which it uses when you are going into oxygen debt, where you're not fully able to just run aerobically, and you have some kind of anaerobic system, which brings quick energy, but maybe isn't as efficient. So that is what the whole point is. So when people talk about lactic acid, that's not the case. It's you have lactate, which your body makes in response to exercising. Crucial difference between anaerobic and aerobic in that one uses oxygen and the other doesn't, hence the terms. It is that one is efficient and slow, the aerobic, and the other is less efficient but delivers lots of energy quickly. And this makes sense, throughout history, you want to be traveling great distances, and so aerobically is the way to go. It's real efficient. You can go forever. I often tell people all the time, especially in ultras, there's this whole thing about eating so much, and I'm like, you don't really need to eat if you're going at the right pace and you train for that pace. You can, everyone, even, I'm a big guy, of course, but even the thinnest person go hundreds and hundreds of miles without really eating if you pace yourself properly. And of course, then the anaerobic comes in handy because it used to be fight or flight, and so you need some quick energy, a quick energy source. So you burn through, you go from the aerobic quickly into the anaerobic stage. But that might be the difference between life and death from catching the prey or being caught by the predator. So once you go hard, you can't supply enough energy aerobically. So some anaerobic energy kicks in regardless of how much oxygen your muscles have. Hard exercise triggers what we call the lactate threshold these days, and back in the old days, washermen called it, old school, was the anaerobic threshold. Levels of lactate in your blood don't just reflect how much your muscles are producing, it's the difference between production and reuse. One adaptation that comes with endurance training is the ability to reuse large amounts of lactate. So you can go anaerobic and use the lactate as fast as you produce it. I remember listening to a podcast, and they were talking to an endurance athlete and professor, and they were talking about lactic acid and, of course, lactate levels, and talking about how, they would swim hard or run hard and then measure these levels, and they would notice that some people could compete at really, really high levels where other people couldn't compete with their lactate levels so high. And then, I've never seen this official, but the guy said that off the record, he had heard that Michael Phelps, when he gets done with a hard workout or a hard race, you'd measure his lactate levels and they would be surprisingly low. And I remember when I first heard this, I thought, that's interesting. Is he just genetically predisposed? But it kind of goes hand in hand with this article. Is basically Michael Phelps, of course, one of the greatest swimmer of all time. His muscles produce lactate, but they also use the lactate as it's produced. So when he gets out after doing the most brutal event, like the 400 individual medley, his lactate level is pretty low, where his competitors will be much higher because his muscles, he's going anaerobic, and his muscles are making lactate, and his body and muscles are trained and probably genetically adapt at using the lactate. So his threshold is way much higher than most other people. So that's a very interesting. It says that there are two thresholds: rest to lactate production, and the intensity where lactate levels are unsustainable. And obviously his lactate level unsustainability is way harder. Of course, exercising above this level will lead to exhaustion. The best way to identify the second threshold is to forget about lactate and identify your critical speed/power. Of course, power with your cyclists. Critical speed can be calculated by plotting at least 3 all-out efforts at different distances. This theoretical speed is your forever speed. Of course, fatigue will set in, but in theory, you could ride this line forever. And, that's the whole thing what Jack Daniels came out with. Instead of VO2 max, he had that V-dot. You plug into his calculator some of your races, and it gives you an idea of what you could. So if you run a 5K, it gives you an idea what you can do a 10K in, marathon in. Also gives you information on what your easy pace should be, your marathon pace, and your threshold pace, hence the whole critical speed. So and he uses races because we figure in a race you're doing an all-out effort, and I've used those calculators since I started coaching back in 2006, and especially with my adult runners as they moved up in distance. I'd say, okay, well, your 5K says, predicts that you should be able to do this, and then if you're not anywhere near that marathon thing, we need to work on some of your systems. And so it's basically, it gives you a really good idea of the strengths and weaknesses of people. It says the gap between lactic threshold and critical speed gives clues to a runner's strengths and weaknesses. Great marathoners, 2 thresholds are close together. So, they muscles start making lactate, and then they can go all the way until they get to where they've made too much lactate, so they can maintain that production and energy systems and keep going. Where middle distances runners, they may start building up lactate really early, but it doesn't go out of control until really high. So your 1,500 or 5,000 guys, they may go out hard. Lactate starts, but it doesn't build up to the levels where they have to stop, and fatigue sets in, and that's why they can bring in that quick energy reserves, and that's how they get to be that way. But you'll notice sometimes the 5K 10 guys, when they move up to the marathon, don't do so well. And in fact, this weekend there's a great Valencia marathon with so many super fast. It's probably one of the fastest marathons of all time, and you'll definitely see this where people are obviously in the aerobic zone, but also putting in some anaerobic energy into there. And so if you did a testing with the lactate, you would see that they've got that fine balance. So now most of us don't have a lab at our disposal, or all this kind of equipment and testing, will we soon do. I mean, look at the watches now they've gotten. So the talk test, which I've always used, is always good. And the talk test is basically easy runs, full sentences, a little harder phrases, and then of course when you're really going hard, single words. My Run Campers Beggars Distance project used to say that my name was a curse word, Andy, and and eventually, if you're an endurance athlete, you need to learn when you hit your threshold and know where it is. And I see this all the time, from races from the mile to the 6-day. People just go out too hard. So, especially if you're in a marathon or beyond, or even half marathon, especially if it's taking you more than a couple hours, you should be able to, especially at the beginning of the race, be able to have a full conversation. And then as things get a little serious, maybe phrases. But you really shouldn't be just doing single words till the very end. Kind of reminds me of, I saw this one thing about, the 3 F's in marathoning or half marathoners. And the 3 F's were basically the first 10 miles, you should have fun. That means talk, enjoy yourself. The next 10 miles, you should be a little more focused, maybe move into that phrases, maybe using that a little bit. And then like the last 10K is to fight, and there you are kind of fighting and to stay right on that threshold balancing act. Enough lactate to power yourself, but not so much lactate that your body shuts down. So this has been some endurance science from an article in Outside Magazine. There'll be links in the show notes. And please subscribe to my channel, The Anti-Noise Experience. And as always, stay healthy, be boring, not epic.